All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for showing up on the first of what is going to be many Tuesday afternoons with Tad and Chad doing some organic Q&A. So let me say hello to my host here, Tad Hussey. How you doing today?
I'm good. I just realized I had the YouTube on in the background, so I was getting an echo, but I got it fixed. Rookie mistake. I'm excited to be here.
Good, good. And it didn't come through. I've done that with my headphones in. I'm like, oh, so embarrassed, but don't worry, we didn't notice. So nobody saw
Okay.
that, nothing to see here. Yeah. Well, dude, thank you again for doing this with me. This is something that we had talked about a little while ago. A few weeks ago, we did a Q&A on dry amendments, which a lot of people really enjoyed. Go back and check that out. We've also have a deeper history working on the Dope History Project, which was a lot of fun. But we've got something new for everybody. This is your chance to kind of get some questions asked and answered. You've got, two different perspectives coming from the same place together, so we can kind of team up on your questions. And we already had one from the dry amendments Q&A that I just wanted to start with. We kind of have a theme for this episode, and it's basically stuff you put on soil. We'll get into that in a second. But I wanted to start here. There was a great question that we had from the YouTube comments in the previous show. And the question here, and I gave my opinion, and I had to cut off the end here. I ran out of characters. He's like, but I really want to hear Tad's options and opinions on what he would do here. So we'll start with that this week, and I'll read it out for you guys. It says, my question is based around living or organic soil is simple. How can you keep a healthy mother plant how can keeping a healthy mother plant be accomplished in living soil? How long can a mother go until it needs to be reset? So I gave my answer, which, well, I might overlap with you, Tad. So I'll let you take this, Tad.
You're welcome to go first.
Okay. Yeah. My quick thing, instantly was, obviously the longer you want to keep it in a larger pot. I did also mention that a lot of people will commonly reset their mothers every 6 months. So is it possible to maybe keep a plant healthy in a living soil for, say, 6 months' time?
Yeah. So in theory, you could keep a plant alive relatively indefinitely. I mean, eventually it's going to succumb to diseases, provided the container is large enough, or you're feeding it in a way, or you're in a fabric pot where there's some root pruning. But what would kill a mother plant is essentially root girdling, where the roots will wrap around in a circle, and eventually the plant would strangle itself. I agree with you. I like to reset my mother plants every cycle, which would be more like every 3 months. So next time you take clones, that one of those healthiest clones becomes your mother plant. And you always want to have healthy mother stock. I've heard it described as like a river. And so everything kind of starts at the top of the river and works its way downstream. And you have to be absolutely the healthiest at the very beginning with your mother plant, and then your clone, and then your veg stock, and then all the way down to your flowering plants. So in theory, your flowering plants could be your dirtiest, quote, dirtiest plants. But that mother plant needs to be pristine before you even think about flower. In terms of ways to keep it healthy, first one is just having a large enough container if we're talking about living soil. If you're trying to keep a plant alive for 3 months, I would want a minimum, and I realize like tent space is valuable if we're talking to, home grow tent growers, maybe a 10 to 15 gallon pot. And also, now that I think about it, if you're constantly taking the same cuts off the same plant, that plant is going to start looking really weird, and eventually the stem's going to get pretty woody, and it's going to be harder and harder to clone off of. Yeah, I would say cycle your mothers. And then my favorite mother stock, bottled nutrient, because a lot of times it's hard to manage your fertility in a mother plant, would be fish hydrolysate. It's going to give you a little bit of N, a little bit of available phosphorus, and a little bit of K. It's just a good all around general fertilizer, something to have on hand. So.
And is that basically like, like fish poop that we see? There's, numerous different brands out there, but fish hydrolysate, is that just kind of the poop that they're skimming from the water, or is that like ground up fish?
Yeah, it's actually a little bit different. So there's two different things here. There's a fish emulsion, which is just the ground up remains of the fish, I believe, which tends to be a little higher in nitrogen. And they're not stabilizing that with phosphoric acid. So you're not getting that P level, which is really important for root health. So that's where the fish hydrolysate's a little different product. So if you see a really high N and low P number, that's going to tell you we're talking about fish emulsion, which is not as good of a product in my opinion for a few different reasons. But yeah, that's just something to watch for.
Okay, well that is good because again, things are easy to get confused when you're at the store or you're ordering. I almost said online, but go to a store if you guys have one. Uh, yeah. And that I mean that kind of brings us into some of the other questions because I don't have a local grocery store anymore. I've got to travel much farther, and they only had one option for me when I got there. So that's a topic for another day. What we're kind of talking about today, and thank you, Tad, for giving your opinion on that. I believe it was Nate who asked that. Hopefully he's watching the show today, or at least catching this on the rerun. Get your questions answered. And everybody in chat, oh my gosh, all of you in chat, thank you for showing up. Thank you for being here. I will be looking for questions in chat as well as in the comments after the show. So stuff you put on soil. You got some weird ones. No pee, no poop. We've already covered that. Put them in the chat. I'll keep my eye open, but we'll keep going on this one. Another question that I had from the comments was about coconut water, and I've heard coconut water before. Sure, you think it almost has like electrolytes. There's some magic in there, maybe some sugars in there, but not a lot of people using it. And I had a question from a person asking if coconut water had the potential to alter the EC, the electrical conductivity. Sometimes, ppm is another thing we look at. EC is the best measurement when you're looking at soil fertility and what's in there. But does it have the potential to change that or maybe affect nutrient uptake by adding coconut water? Or is there much known about that?
Yeah, I actually just got an email today about coconut water. Someone asked me what levels of potassium are in it, because when we talk about EC, what we're talking about there, or ppms, just a calculation, is the level of fertility in that product or in that soil. And yeah, so basically the reason someone might use coconut water would be for potassium, an electrolyte, like you mentioned. It's one way to get potassium. And then also for the various amounts of enzymes that are in there. And enzymes are just things that speed up reactions. So in theory, they make chemical reactions happen faster. I don't personally use coconut water, or the other version of this would be like an SST, like a sprouted seed tea. But the reasons people do it is specifically for that, enzymes. And then in the case of coconut water, I would say potassium. And so, yes, you would get higher levels of potassium in your soil over time if you're adding coconut water, and that would raise your EST, or your EC. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is something to aware. If your EC gets too high in your soil, it can cause osmotic pressure on the roots, which just means that it's harder for the plant to take up nutrients and access things because of the high salt content, because all of these things are salts. Potassium's a salt when we talk about it. So, yeah.
And in the context of a living soil, particularly if you were doing beds, or again, that early example where you're keeping that mother plant, small amounts doesn't really equal a problem, but over time, the compounding of, what you're adding in could potentially lead to an issue, but not very common or widely used out there.
I think a lot of home growers use it. I don't really see it a lot at facilities, mostly because of the cost of it. It's not, doesn't tend to be very affordable to use a lot of these things. And just as a general philosophy, I tend to try to use less products in my garden for a couple of reasons. One, because I'm cheap and these things cost money. Two, the more things I add, the harder it is for me to determine what's actually doing what. If I add 3 things, how do I know that only product A helped? Or do I need product A and product B? Or, is product C doing anything? Like, it gets very confusing. And then you end up stuck using all these products if you have a good run. Or if you have a really bad run, now you're stuck trying to figure out what it was that ruined it. So for me, simplifying things, just having, figuring out what your plant actually needs. What's your limiting factor of growth? And right now we're talking about soil, but if you have, let's say it's 50, 60 degrees in your grow room, that's your limiting factor of growth. It doesn't matter if you have the world's greatest soil, your plant's going to be suffering from that. If you have poor lighting, you're 200, 300 ppfd in flower, that your plant wouldn't matter how good your soil is. So you kind of have to back up a little bit and just have this philosophy of looking at what's limiting the growth of your plant. And if it's potassium, then I would lean towards using something like potassium sulfate, because it's 50% potassium. You're using a tiny amount. It's super cheap. And that's an easy way to get potassium in a controlled amount. But that being said, there's nothing wrong with using coconut water. Some people love it. I would consider using it if I wanted to run a trial on it in my home grow. Try it out.
Yeah, and I love that answer too, because try it out. That's a lot of times an answer I'll give if I know people aren't gonna hurt their plants. If it doesn't really gonna cause detriment to them, sure, give it a try. See if you notice a difference. I also say don't put all your eggs in one basket. Maybe do a few plants with that and the rest with your regular routine, so you're not shooting yourself in the foot if things go wrong. But I love that answer. And Kazome Garden Gnomes kind of follow up on that. He's asking, he says, does coconut water have natural PGRs? PGRs are like plant growth regulators. Some are not natural. Clobutanol is one. Makes rock hard buds. Horrible. I think it's cyanide or something. It turns into something bad when you combust it. So no. A lot of people are like, no PGRs, no PGRs. But then you also have things like kelp, which are a natural PGR. So I personally don't know if coconut water has any. I don't know if anybody's ever looked at that. But have you heard of that, Tad? Does coconut water have natural PGRs?
I have no idea. That's a good question. Yeah. One thing to consider when we talk about PGRs, though, they're not all, they're plant growth regulators. So like, for example, auxins regulate the growth at the meristem, as I understand it. It's been a little while since I've thought about PGRs, honestly, but PGRs don't necessarily mean like bigger buds or larger yields. You can use them by manipulating these regulators in a way to have a shorter, stockier plant or maybe larger flowers. But just the fact that it's a PGR just means that it somehow regulates a chemical response in the plant in terms of the plant's physiology. It doesn't necessarily mean it's good or bad. It's just something that the plant's going to do that you can now have more control over by adding this plant growth regulator.
My favorite video, and we saw this in school when we were talking about just them used in commercial agricultural crops, but a field in China of watermelons. They had used too many PGRs, and the watermelons just grew and they exploded. So it's just a whole field of exploded watermelons. So
no.
That's a fun one to Google if you want to check it out. Watermelons, PGRs, China. Okay.
All right.
Thanks for going deeper on that one. Another question, and this one is probably one of the most common ones. As a home grower, I have done this. I've never really seen it done commercially. Anyways, molasses. Molasses, a lot of people will put onto soil. We've kind of heard about, like bricks and plant health, and bricks is sugars. And so a lot of times people are like, if I add molasses, then I'm adding sugars and it's going to help the plant. But it's not necessarily a direct A and B. There's kind of an intermediary there, and that's the microbes. But what do you feel about molasses as far as something people would use in the end of flower? Is it going to serve a benefit, or is it a detriment, or is it just kind of neutral?
So when I think of, well, you brought up some good points. So first of all, adding molasses to your soil is not going to make your buds sweeter. Just like the whole idea of adding Kool-Aid to your soil is not going to make your bud sweeter or red or any of that. So yeah, you're right. There's that intermediary. So I just want to get that out of the way. And that's the microbes. So I've always thought of molasses as microbe food. It has a little bit of potassium in it, but really these are sugars that feed the microbes in your soil. And one myth that I've heard is that molasses is just a bacterial food. It's not. I've used molasses all the time with my microscope to grow out fungi. So it grows great amounts of fungal hyphae too. So it's just a good all around micro food. Now, if your soil is healthy and you want to put a little bit of molasses out there as a way of increasing that nutrient cycling and the activity by more reproducing microbes, more reproducing more nutrient cycling happening in your soil. That's good. The best way to do that would be just a tiny amount, maybe a 1 to 2 teaspoons or a tablespoon per gallon of water. You're not adding very much, and just watering that in when you go. If you get, if you have a soil pathogen like Fusarium or Phytophthora, then you could exacerbate it and make it worse by adding a food source that they could eat too. So that's something to be aware of. Just knowing your soil. And then also if you add too much and those microbes reproduce too rapidly, that can cause problems as well, either by creating anaerobic conditions that could maybe be low oxygen, which doesn't allow the roots to breathe as well, or allows more pathogens to grow. That could be an issue. So tiny amount with greater frequency is just a good general rule for any of these things. Same with the coconut water. But it's a really safe, there's nothing wrong with using molasses. It's very affordable. You can go down to your local grocery store and find it. Just be sure to get unsulfured blackstrap molasses. The sulfur will kill the microbes. That's why it's added. You don't want that for what you're using it for with gardening.
Nice, because I did remember, it was like get the unsulfured kind, unsulfured. Yeah, you usually find it sitting right next to it. I think I still have the bottle sitting in the cabinet. I haven't used it for a long time, but I like to play around. And here's one question too, because I believe it's phosphorus or potassium that bananas are supposed to have a lot of for the body. If you get muscle cramps, eat a banana. And there's all kinds of things that you can make a tea with. But since we were talking about that, is a banana peel tea better to use in comparison to like coconut water? Or is it even something you would consider using? Is it transfer? Is there, through the tea process, does that actually come out of the peels into the solution in a form the plants can absorb it?
I have no clue. And that's the thing about some of these teas, like you might get a little bit of potassium, but my guess would be that there's probably not a lot of available potassium seeping out of that banana peel into a form that's going to be available to your plants. So like you might get a little bit in the water, but realistically, a pinch of potassium sulfate, which is pennies to the dollar, would give you a much stronger plant response.
Awesome. Thank you.
But yeah, one of these things too that's really important to think about is it's all about balance. So having way too much potassium is going to make other cations like calcium and magnesium less available. Having way too much magnesium is going to tighten your soil and make calcium unavailable. So all of these things are tools used in small amounts to try and get our soil to the optimum level of fertility for the plant.
Balance, all about balance. So important. A lot of people, and I was guilty, but I started growing a long time ago before there was a lot of good information. But I'm like, if I had twice the amount of nutrients, then I'm going to have fatter buds.
Yeah.
We know that's not necessarily true at this point. Okay, so molasses, it can be beneficial, but there are also things to consider. Ultimately, go ahead.
Yeah, have you used molasses or coconut water in your grows at all with your plants?
Yeah. Yep, I've used molasses, but that was before I really had a solid understanding of the microbial activity. A lot of what we do in cannabis, particularly starting out, and this is something I always encourage, is like learn the why. Because as you go through and you watch different shows, you're able to pick up, the SOPs. Do this, do that. Here you go. And a lot of times, fortunately, these days, because there is better information out there, you can get a pretty decent harvest if things go right.
Mhm.
But you don't necessarily think of why, when I add this, is it a good thing? And so now I know more. And thinking back to the times where I was using molasses, again, I didn't really know about microbes, so I wasn't adding them. I probably did not have a very big, diverse microbial, you know, colony in my Fox Farm ocean forest soil. So
Mm.
was it really helping? I don't know. But I also molasses, I also file under the maybe it does, maybe it doesn't category. Because at the home grow at the tent level, when I'm talking about like 4 plants, I'm not really noticing a huge difference in bud shapes. It could have been another variable that led to maybe a slight difference from this run to that run. Um,
Mhm.
Commercially, if you're able to gain 2 grams per plant and you've got 100,000 plants, well, then absolutely you're doing that. But as a home grower, I didn't really see much. But maybe if I revisit it with, well, actually, kind of now I'm thinking about it, I do use it. It's part of recharge. So
Mm.
there is some powder molasses, I believe, in the recharge itself. But to what we were talking about, literally, I think it's grandma's brand blackstrap unsulfured molasses from the jar. I haven't used that for a while.
Yeah. I the only thing I use molasses for is when I'm making a compost tea. It's a great
Okay.
microbe food for that. A little bit of molasses, a little bit of organic alfalfa meal. And I like the liquid molasses for that. I haven't tested the dried molasses, but sometimes they use like binders and things that will affect it. Like, for example, I tested, there was a fish powder, and I was like, oh, I don't have to buy the liquid fish. I can just buy this fish powder, dried fish powder instead. It was spray dried fish powder. And I was like, oh, this is amazing. But then when I tried it out, looked under the microscope, I found that the microbial activity was nothing like
Huh.
what it was with using like fish hydrolysate or something like that. So that was something to consider. And then oh, I forgot to mention there is coconut powder, so you can make your own coconut water. We do sell it. I do sell it, even though I don't use it because people want it, and we can get it in large quantities fairly inexpensively. So it's a lot cheaper to, if you can, if with a lot of products, if you can buy them in powder form, you're going to save a ton of money on not using liquids. And like fish hydrolysate is one of the few liquid products that I really like to use because I think it works well.
Now, is that a smelly ingredient? Are we going to get in trouble with significant others if we're mixing that and doing that in the house?
I don't have a great sense of smell, so I'm not the person to ask. But I will say there is a slight fish ocean smell to it, but probably less than you would get from like trying to cut open a salmon on your kitchen counter
Okay.
to make dinner. So
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah, not rank. When it comes to foul fish, there's really not a medium. It's either not or it is. And it's kind of funny you say that too. My sense of smell isn't the best, but that also really helps me pheno hunt because when I'm finding stuff, if like my wife, she loves it. She's like, "Oh, it all smells so good." She's like, "Oh, the smell of this one's so great." I'm
yeah,
like, if I smell it on the plant, I'm like, okay, this something special about this one. So I
yeah,
have
yeah.
come across my fish products where I'm just like, oh God, that's leading to divorce. Take it out to the shed.
I find fish emulsion tends to have a much stronger odor than fish hydrolysate. So
Yeah, and
yeah,
again, the emulsion, which we learned earlier, the emulsion is kind of fish bits ground up. The other is more kind of the fish waste products.
yeah, I did a whole
Correct.
podcast on just the
Really?
process with a guy for Dram who that makes it, and it was a while ago. I don't remember everything, but someone could go back to the podcast and do a deep
Good.
dive on it if they really wanted to learn about it.
Nice. Well, let's real quick. tell us about your other podcast. I know we didn't plan this, but since we're on the
Oh,
subject, please tell them about
yeah.
this other podcast as well.
Yeah, so I have a podcast called Cannabis Cultivation and Science. We're on our 6th year. It's pretty fun. I've had a lot of great guests over the years talking about like really deep dive on topics. So it's kind of like more, I'd say more advanced in some ways.
Mhm.
Because they do, these are like researchers who specialize in like hop latent viroid or specialize in, whatever topic we're talking about. So sometimes, a lot of times I'll talk to geneticists or people that are like way knowledgeable on topics that I don't know a lot about. And so a lot of times it's over my head too, but a lot of really good information on there. And I'm pretty grateful for the opportunity to have the podcast. So yeah.
Cool. I've enjoyed it, and I know others have enjoyed it. We also did the Dope History podcast together. So if you guys want to
Yes.
check out some of the founders from the cannabis industry back before it was even thought of being legal, go check out dopehistory.com. You can find them all uploaded there. So please do check that one out. Some good stuff. But yeah, that's the fun thing about doing a podcast sometimes is you get to ask questions that are over your head. We're all kind of learning above our pay grade, which is awesome because as we come up to it, things start making sense. I always say just absorb what you can. It will make sense one day. But we're starting here with terminology, and that's the base of understanding all of the scientific people is we need to speak the same language. And a lot of cannabis terminology isn't exactly proper, but in talking with cannabis people, it gets you close enough.
Yeah, and I'm excited to do this Tuesday's live thing with you because I rarely get to talk to a lot of home growers. And it's you and I were talking about this before the show, but it's a very different mentality. And I was struggling to come up with things that would be different for me that I would do commercially versus in a home grow. And you brought up a bunch of stuff, and that was really interesting for me. So I'm excited to talk about some of the basics and kind of just get back to like the roots of growing and simplify things and not be talking about all that complicated stuff sometimes too. Yeah.
And this is where my heart is. I'm fascinated with the more advanced stuff, and everybody is going to get there one day. That's the goal of any journey, keep progressing. But I want to get people growing. And to get people growing, you can't overload them with too much information because, like I said, a lot of it just gets you this much more better results. Let's give them the basics. So back to stuff you put on soil. Surfactants. Surfactants is an awesome special word. I used to say in layman's term, it makes water wetter. How is that even possible? But let's talk about that because surfactants, typically silica is the one that we use in cannabis or we hear like home growers being used. What are some different kinds of surfactants, and are there any kinds that are maybe harmful to the environment, specifically fish?
Yeah, absolutely. And I am not an expert on surfactant. Brandon Hudson, who works with me, knows way more about surfactants, and maybe we can get him on here one day. But basically, you're right. Surfactants make water wetter, makes things stickier. So if you are doing a foliar application, and let's say you need to, your soil is peat based and it's very hydrophobic, meaning you go to water and because it's dry, and you go to water and all the water just runs right through your pot. That means it doesn't want to accept more water. And so by adding a surfactant, you can make the water a little bit stickier and it will stick to the soil and it won't run right through as much. So in terms of common surfactants, dish soap is probably the most common. If you even just want to put a drop or two of dish soap in with your water or add it to your foliar application, that will work just fine. It's not going to kill everything in your soil. It'll be okay.
One drop a gallon or a couple drops per gallon?
Yeah, maybe a drop or two.
Okay. Not the whole bottle, just
no, just the tiniest amount. But this is like I said, this is, we'll do things on a budget all the way to like if you want to really throw money at it. Aloe is another form of surfactant, and these surfactants all have different saponins in them too, which is another topic as well that again, this is not my area of expertise, but Brandon could speak to it much more intelligently. But the main ones that I think of when I think of like horticultural surfactants or saponins would be yucca, aloe, Kiaha is another one that you see out there. You do have to be careful. I believe it's aloe. It's either aloe or yucca that can be a little bit harmful to, or not a little bit toxic, sorry, to marine life, marine ecosystems. So in your home grow, that's perfectly fine, but I wouldn't be spraying it on an outdoor grow that might have groundwater going down into your local stream or something like that. Yeah, I see someone in the comments mention soap nuts that has saponins that will also work as a surfactant. So yeah, there's a lot of options. I think any of them are fine. I don't use a ton of surfactants in general, but I might use a little bit of like Thermex 70, which is yucca based. If I had very hydrophobic soil, or if I was doing a foliar application and I needed it to really stick to the leaves. But I kind of have an IPM program like for managing pests that doesn't really involve using a lot of surfactants or saponin based products, but we sell them.
Let's see. Oh, what about Bob's asking about the yucca kills fish? I believe it does deplete the oxygen from the water, and that's one of the issues. It could lead to algae blooms, which again further throws off the balance of oxygen in the water, and that can lead to fish die off. So I believe that's what it was. And soap nuts on kind of like a smaller level. I thought that it was more toxic than it actually is, doing a little bit of further research on it, because that one was really popular for a while. And I think it's because saying, what's happening, is so fun. Anytime brings up, well, I use saponins. I still can't resist myself in chat. I know what they are, but you're always going to get a, what's happening from me. This is awesome. I'm checking off all the questions here in chat. You guys are
let's do it. Awesome.
So yeah, I'm getting some more. Okay, see, I got so distracted with my what's happening, because that's just fun to say. All right, but going back to it, there
are good questions on here.
Yeah, and I've started a bunch of them here, and if we don't get to them, so everybody watching, originally the idea was to do a 20-minute show, 20-minute questions on Tuesdays. We're like, it might stretch to 30 minutes. We're at 30 minutes right now, and we've got a bunch of awesome questions. So I will be cataloging some of these, and we'll get to them in a future episode. But I think we can run a little bit long today if you're good for a couple more minutes, Tad.
Yeah, I'm having fun. Let's answer a few more questions.
Good. Me too. Yes. All right. So here's, I'll just start with the top of what I starred today. Lucky Pat says, what can I add to Fox Farms Ocean Forest? Because as a grower, that is the most widely available soil that you will find in a soil store. So that's a lot of times what people use. I want to amend eventually, but not sure what to add. I am using earth boxes. And I'll kind of start answering the question for us, because last episode we were talking on the Q&A for dry amendments. We were talking about soil testing. And soil testing was really the right step at the end of it, because it gives you a picture of what was depleted from the soil. You earlier were mentioning balance. You want to get that all up there. And one of the things was, like cost. It turned out not to be super cost prohibitive if you're doing it once a run at the end. So can you maybe tell us what your answer would be, Tad? And also, what does a soil test cost? And, KIS Organics does soil tests, and you also help decipher them too, don't you?
Yeah, so I'll mention what we do, but I'll also mention some other options.
Yeah, please.
Just to keep it all fair. So Fox Farms Ocean Forest, or Happy Frog, or Pro Mix from Premier are kind of the three things I think of that you can pretty much find anywhere in the country, which is really convenient. Ocean forest is going to have a little more fertility than those other two options, which is good and bad. It's good in the sense that you will not need to add as much fertilizer. It's bad in the sense that you don't really know exactly where you're starting with it. But you could develop kind of a program around knowing like, okay, I'm going to have this much fertility in ocean forest, and then I want to add this much more. And so we came up with a product called our nutrient pack, originally because it was so expensive to ship people soil. And they said, okay, source your peat, compost, pumice, perlite, whatever, locally. And then you can mix in our nutrient pack, and that's all the minerals and nutrients you would need for a full cycle. Now, ideally, you're building your own soil around your compost. So I'm getting a little off topic here, but basically what I want to get at is, as you add these things, our nutrient pack, and other companies make them too, are just my best attempt to balance the fertility in a soil that doesn't have a lot of fertility, like a Pro Mix or a Happy Frog. Ocean forest is going to have a little bit more, so I'd probably use a little less of the nutrient pack. That being said, you could also go down to your local, wherever you got the potting soil, and pick up some, tomato fertilizer or something with an NPK that's, I like, there's a bunch of different ratios out there that people like, and the ones for veg are going to be a little different than the ones for flower, and the ones for a full cycle are going to be different than both. But that's an easy way to start too, is just add a little bit of tomato fertilizer, for example, to an ocean forest bag, and that will get you started. And then better to add fertilizer a couple weeks before you think the plant's really running out of it. If you wait till you actually see a plant that's nitrogen deficient, for example, that's yellowing from the bottom up, it's already a little bit too late to add that dry fertilizer, because it's going to take 7 to 10 days for it to actually work. And at that point, your plant's suffering. So, and which is going to affect your yield and make you more susceptible to disease. So we want to address these things a little bit earlier. And so ideally, like you said, soil testing allows us to just nail in exactly how much nitrogen we need to add, how much calcium might be lacking, and get our pH in the optimal range for nutrient uptake, all of those things. But a soil test is going to run you, I think, $55, $60 plus the shipping to mail it in. And then if you want the analysis too, like from us, you're looking at about $90 for the complete test and analysis sent back to you. And then you still have to get the amendments. If you have 4 plants, it's probably not worth it, to spend that you could spend that $90 on fertilizer or
new soil. Yeah.
New soil
or
something. Yeah. So there's absolutely a balance there. Like for me, in my outdoor garden, I'm staring at it right now out the window. I'm not going to do a soil test, because we live in the Northwest. It rains like crazy. I know there's no nitrogen in there. I know what I started with, because I put our biochar soil in there to start. So I know what kind of levels of phosphorus and things are in there. And I'm going to make my best guess. I'm not going to soil test, because I don't want to spend that $90. For my indoor garden, which I think I've shown on Instagram a few times, and I'll get another cycle going soon, I'm absolutely going to test it, because for me, that $90 is worth it. I've already got the test results, and now I can add exactly what I need back in to get it back up to exactly the targets that I want for cannabis.
And let's say, he had, 6 different pots. Let's say he had 6 5-gallon containers in there. You don't necessarily have to do 6 separate tests. Actually, it would be preferred, because like in a living soil bed, you're just getting little samples from different areas of the soil. So if that grower then put everything into like the kiddie pool to mix it, or on a tarp, mixed the soil, and then took his samples, you could get a good representative test for all of the soil that they need to amend. So
absolutely. And even with large commercial grows, we tend to tell them to just do 1 test per room or 2 tests per room, unless you have an outlier bed or something like that, because it's just too expensive. We can get a pretty good idea, because we've had guys test every single bed in a facility, and they'll have 20 or 30 tests in a room, and at the end of the day, they're close enough that we can make the same recommendation more or less for the whole room. And so they could have saved on 19 of those tests, for example. So Yeah, little things we've learned over the years.
Awesome. All right, let's keep this rolling. We've got that one taken care of. Steve, who cares, is asking, should I run calcium from start to finish in organics? Let's just assume that he is meaning an organic bed. Let's say it's a 4x4 bed. Yeah, let's start there.
That is a complicated question that we could do a whole live just on calcium. Short answer, it depends. If we're talking about gypsum, no, you can't overdo it. And you should absolutely run it over cycle. If we're talking about dolomite or dolomitic lime or egg lime, yes, you could get into trouble by adding too much of it. Because dolomite is calcium magnesium carbonate. That's going to raise your pH, and it's probably going to add too much magnesium to your soil. Most people get enough magnesium when they make a living soil just from the compost fraction. We rarely have to add magnesium. And when we do add magnesium, Epsom salt is super easy and affordable. So unless I see a magnesium deficiency, I'm not adding magnesium. So I rarely use dolomite lime. Egg lime is going to raise your pH quite a bit. And that can be problematic because when we get above 7.4, 7.5, now we're getting into a range where it's much harder for the plant to assimilate nutrients. So whereas with gypsum, calcium sulfate, the solubility of the gypsum, this is actually really interesting and something that I've learned fairly recently is the reason I've always known you couldn't overdo gypsum. Agronomists make these recommendations for massive amounts of gypsum in their soil. And the reason they get away with that is because the solubility of gypsum in water is almost perfect for releasing the levels of calcium and sulfur that plants want and need. Because you can't overdo the sulfur, and the sulfur balances out the calcium in terms of the pH levels. So it doesn't raise your pH. So it's really an optimal soil amendment. Now, if we're starting with peat moss, the pH is going to be really low, and we want to raise that pH through adding alkaline amendments like, egg, lime, magnesium, potassium. All thes things are cations. Biochar tends to be alkaline. Compost tends to be alkaline. They're going to raise your pH. So if you have a pH meter, you can kind of get into that range that you want. Let's say 6 to 7 is a pretty healthy range. Calcium is absolutely important to all stages of plant growth. It's not primarily. It moves through the xylem, which is the same way that water moves through the plant. So it's tied to transpiration. So how well that plant is able to move water up into the leaves and out through the stomata is going to control how well calcium moves through that plant. So watering becomes key, having the right environment when we're talking about the levels of humidity and temperature, and which leads to vapor pressure differential VPD is so important to calcium management. But you absolutely want to have calcium through all stages of growth. It's going to help dramatically with disease resistance and overall plant health. It's one of the most important things for growing a happy and healthy plant.
I was actually just watching a clip you had earlier about calcium in the plants in the early flowering stages and the benefits against PM or some mildew. So that was, I'm like, okay, interesting. So yeah, that's good. Thank you for answering that one, because a lot of people I hear currently talking about, well, you want to front load your calcium, make sure you get a lot of calcium in veg, but there's a way to do it correctly, which is balance, and then you don't want to overload it. But it does sound like it still needs some going through the flowering phase, because it's another question I get a lot is like, well, when do I cut this out? When do I stop this? When do I stop that? And things change too. Things are moving target. I mean, 10 years ago, it would have been like, absolutely cut nitrogen at the day you start flower. Now it's a little bit, you still need some. And I'm going off into the weeds here. I'm getting into technical small differences. I'll get back on track with stuff you put on soil. Calf snake oil had a question here. Seed sprout teas would be more beneficial than coconut water. We can skip the comparison of which is more beneficial, but seed sprout teas, that's a great thing for plants, isn't it?
Yeah, I would think the coconut water would give you more potassium, but the sprouted seed teas would give you more enzymatic activity. I did a trial in my tomato greenhouse years ago when Coot was first kind of came up with this idea. And props to Clackamas Coot for this and many other things. He deserves that credit. And we would spend hours on the phone talking about topics like this. And basically, the idea is if you take the barley seed, which is malted, so it's been arrested for growing for making beer, essentially, for brewing or for whiskey, and it's been arrested at the highest level of enzymatic activity when it's malted. They've taken care of that for you. Then you can use malted barley instead of sorry, I'm getting a little off, but instead of sprouting a seed itself and then taking that and trying to arrest it at that same point by stopping the growth and then blending it and then applying it. So the idea is that seeds have all this enzymatic activity, all these things, hormonal changes and things happening right when they first start growing. And we're trying to take that and then apply it to your plants. And that's kind of the idea behind coconut water is you're taking the embryo of the seed, you're taking the water out of that, which is super, active. It's essentially the world's largest seed. And then you can put that on your plants. It's going to have the same benefits. I did not notice a huge difference in my garden using sprouted seed teas. That being said, before everyone gets mad at me, a lot of people swear by them and love them. I work with commercial facilities even that use them. So I'm not saying that anything I did was definitive in that regard. I'm not convinced. Like, if you want to do it, I would say just pick up some malted barley and grind it up and do it that way, rather than going through the hassle of, because the other thing too is if you sprout the seed and you let it go a little too long, it can actually ferment and start producing alcohols, and that's absolutely bad for your plant roots. So it's just a little more complicated. If we want to simplify it, just get some malted barley, grind it up, apply it, water it in, and you're done. But yeah, I'm not convinced that there's a huge difference in the enzymes from these different seeds that's going to really promote more growth than another.
Okay.
But yeah, people love to experiment with it, and I highly encourage people to experiment with it. I wouldn't say it's something that you need in your garden. It's kind of one of those extra things after you've mastered all the other stuff, like watering, which is by far the most important thing that we haven't even talked about. So I would like to start with all that stuff first. Get your lighting down, get your watering down, get your room dialed in, and then you want to do seed teas and compost teas and all the other stuff we've talked about. Then you could consider it. Yeah.
Right. Again, bringing it back to the good point of, get dialed in on things, and then you can start adding, you have to have a foundation to know if something is beneficial. If you start out your first run doing all of these things, you don't really have a frame of reference for did it help or did it not. So starting basic. And luckily for me, my the only soil store or the only grow store around here is / brewery store, so they've got their plenty of barley there.
Yeah, and that's I just want to touch on this because I'm looking through the comments. When we talk about malted barley, the reason that they malt the barley is because it freezes that barley when it has the highest level of enzymatic activity, because you need those enzymes in the beer brewing process to break down the sugars and create the alcohol in the beer. So it's exceptionally high in enzymatic activity, as I understand it, and that's why it's used as a part of the brewing process. Again, I'm not an expert on this, but that's what, from my own reading, that's what I've learned about it. So
awesome, man. Gateway Garden Guy. I do have one of your questions starred here, and I think we're going to get to it next episode. Gateway to the Garden. But thanks for bringing this up, because he says, heads up, it's being simulcasted on Chad's channel. Yes, this is simulcasting on both the KIS Organics channel and the Chad Westport YouTube channel. All of the questions are actually showing up over here. We tested this earlier, but maybe we just haven't got to some of them, and all the ones we've asked so far have been from the chat on my channel. But yes, these are simulcasted. You can catch them both places. Regardless of where you enter your question, we will get them. Also, you could always enter them into the comments as well. But let me go back up here, Gateway to the Garden, because I did star the question you had about dissolved oxygen. We will get to that on the next one, because that's a great question. I'd love to expand on that, because I have had people directly hit me up too. But one more question here, which Greg has given us a great segue to. He's talking about a new style of chlorine that doesn't gas off. And that was kind of one of the last questions I wanted to get to today, because again, putting stuff on, we put our water on, and we always hear about chlorine, and I believe it's chloramine. One off gases, the other sits, because the wife's tale, or the gardener's tale, something I've done for a long time. Leave your water sitting for 24 hours. If you get it out of the tap, leave the water sit for 24 hours before you apply it to your plants. There'll be less chlorine or chloramine. So can you maybe bring a little more clarification to the differences of those two, or what this myth is based in?
Yeah. So first off, I just want to say that water quality is super important. Whenever I move to a new spot, I always to get my water tested. I think that's the first thing you should do. It's like 25 or 30 bucks through Logan Labs. We sell it on our website for the same price, so you can order it through us. And we offer a water suitability analysis. It's called an irrigation suitability test. And we can tell you, like, is your water suitable for growing plants, or is it bringing in too many chlorides, or have too much sodium, which are not. The sodium, for example, is not an essential plant nutrient. It will cause problems over time by raising your EC. That bringing it back to your coconut water question. So always test your water. That being said, in terms of keeping your water safe from pathogens for us to drink, things like E. coli, salmonella, stuff like that, they're going to add some sort of disinfectant, in this case, chlorine or chloramines. Now, here in my area where I live, they use chlorine. Chlorine is not a very stable element. It'll off gas, like you mentioned. You can bubble it, or you can add any kind of organic matter too, but it will just over time with air disappear. And you could probably just use your nose to say, okay, I don't smell it anymore. It's probably mostly gone. I water my garden with chlorinated water, just because it's not worth it for me in this case to remove it, because there's so much organic matter in the soil, and I don't see a lot of. Yes, there potentially is a tiny amount of microbial loss, but I don't see it being a huge issue. There's not a ton of chlorine in my water either. Chloramine, on the other hand, is a much more stable form of chlorine, and essentially you need to add some kind of organic matter to complex the chloramine to remove it out of your soil. And that could be as simple as a carbon filter. You could pick up one of those inline filters. I think Hydrologic makes some, Boogie Brew. You could get a cheap RV inline filter that they sell if you wanted to remove it. You could just, if you had a reservoir, you could just throw a handful of soil in there. That would take care of it. An old shoe, literally anything. It just needs some sort of organic matter to interact with, and then that will remove the chloramine. So yeah, I think that kind of answered it. Citric acid is another great option. A vitamin C tablet, 500 milligrams would treat 5 gallons of water, no problem too.
Okay, and Bonsai Garden Guy brings up the point here, and I don't know that we're top of my head. I don't have the answer to the max. I'm sure we could find that, but kind of the point, because I see some people in chat, never water with chlorine. Yeah, duh. You never want to add chlorine in a concentrated form to your plants, but that's not what we're doing, and that's why I highlighted this question of ppms, because for this last run I am guilty of taking it straight from the tap, 5 minutes later doing my thing to the water, and then applying it to the plants. I haven't noticed a difference in my plants. Now, maybe I am just blessed with a low chlorine or chloramine in the water, but we also know that there is, bioaccumulation. And that's where the ppm comes into it. If my water has a low enough ppm of this chlorine, I can add it until it reaches an unsafe level. How long and how many waters it takes to reach that unsafe level, I'm not sure if that's a mark that I will hit over the course of this run. So again, best practices would say let it sit for a while, but in this example of me not doing that, I haven't seen detrimental effects. So maybe I'm just lucky. But yeah, to the chat, never use chlorine water. It's, what is your other options? Reverse osmosis? Does that strip out the chlorine as well? I'd imagine it would. I don't know though.
Yeah, like I said, I don't really worry about it. In theory, it's going to kill a small amount of microorganisms in your soil because that's why we add it. But
Okay.
like you said, it's really all about dosage. I mean, we're talking such a tiny amount of chlorine that it's really not causing an issue. I just, while we're talking, I just did a quick Google search. It looked at, researchers found that water chlorinated at 5 parts per million killed organisms only in the top half inch of the soil. Organisms deeper than 1/2 inch were thriving. So yeah, it could have a little bit of die off. But then the other thing too, you have to think about is, if you're watering with like a watering wand, like I do with like a dram water breaker, oxygen is being added at a very high level to that water. It's being aerated as it's being sent out through the wand. The amount of chlorine surviving that process, again, chlorine, not chloramine, is probably even smaller. So I don't get too concerned about it. But yeah, if you are, adding a simple garden filter is a really easy solution, and then you don't even have to have this conversation at all.
Cool. Awesome. Well, that's a good one because that comes up very early in the conversation when it comes to cannabis growing, because we all know that watering is one of the trickier things. Easy when you got it dialed. There's a process to get it dialed in though. And of course, what comes with the water? Well, it's the conversation. Are you using the right stuff? You even mentioned it. Water quality is super important. So it's
can we just address this? This is a good question by Dad's Tent here. Not even comment. Sorry.
Yep.
He said, you literally spent half the night telling me ways to add more microbes. Who gives a fuck about if chlorine kills 10%? And that's, I think, an interesting point. So yes, microbes are obviously super important. They cycle the nutrients. We need them to make the nutrients available in an organic system. The rhizosphere, the area around the roots, is much larger than just this tiny fraction of the top of the soil. The amount of chlorine in the water is probably not all that much, and it's off-gassing pretty rapidly. I'm just trying to talk about how do we do this as simply as possible for you guys. Like, do you need an inline filter and you can't grow without, you can't grow plants with chlorinated water without one? No. And that's kind of what I wanted to get at is like, yeah, in a perfect system, if we had a commercial facility, we'd remove the chlorine before we water. Yes.
Right.
Could you do that at home too? Yes. If it gives you the peace of mind, absolutely do it. But at the end of the day, you're not losing the majority of the microbes in your soil. They're much, your soil has much deeper depth than this little half inch that your plant's pulling from. And at the end of the day, these microbes, one thing that when I mentioned that little article there doesn't talk about is I guarantee that top half inch is recolonized with bacteria, 8 hours later. So at the end of the day, I don't think it's it's not as controversial as a topic as I think it ends up being in a lot of organic growers' eyes. So,
yeah. Well, there's no such thing as agreement in the cannabis world because we all have to steadfast on particular ways, even if we learn information that would change our opinion. This way or die.
So. Honestly, I've been pushing more people towards RO water though lately because of heavy metals more than anything. Because the levels of heavy metals in water that may be suitable for you and I to drink, we can drink a gallon a day and we're well below our, whatever the EPA decides is a safe threshold or the FDA. I don't know who regulates it on that end. But when we put in a commercial grow, when we put, 40,000 gallons of water through a room and we're reusing that soil over time, that arsenic actually contributes a significant amount of arsenic overall to our soil that the plants are then taking up, and it's ending up in the bud. So if I was a medical patient and I was really concerned about my health, and I was consuming a lot of cannabis, I would be much more concerned about filtering the water to remove any potential arsenic, and also to filter, and also to make sure that my soil is very low in arsenic, cadmium, lead, all of those things. If I was at risk of cancer or dealing with this for a medical purpose, it's absolutely concerned. Something we can talk about in the future too. But I know we've already gone over. I'm so excited to do this with you. I wanted to bring up some of the other topics before we sign off that I'm really excited about. So I'm also doing this on Wednesdays with Bryant Mason, the soil doctor, and him and I are going to talk this week about what do you have in the grower's pantry? What do you like to keep in your closet for growing? And with Bryant, he's large scale farmer, works with large facilities. It's a different picture because your budget is different. And I'm really excited to do this with you as a home grower and kind of show you what I use and be curious to see what you use, and then hear what other people in the comments section are using in their grow, and what you think is a must have in your garden. It doesn't have to be a product. It can be, a tool or, whatever. I think that'll be a lot of fun.
I love the idea. That is a great topic because, as we're starting the home growers we do things differently than commercial. Just sometimes it's budget reasons, as you mentioned, but yeah, there's a lot of different things. So my tool shed for my grow and a commercial grow are going to be different. So we could get into that. I would love to. Everybody in chat, definitely type in some of your things. Give us some good feedback. You've been giving us great feedback. You've been giving us great questions. I almost expanded on the reverse osmosis water, and I'm like, no, we just gotta stop.
I know.
So this has been fun.
Forever.
I know. We could.
You have an awesome group of people in this chat. It's really fun. So I would love to do this again. And we're going to do this again. I'm looking forward to next week.
Next Tuesday, 2 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, 5 on the East Coast. We're going to do this again. So if everybody gives us a like, hopefully people give us a like. Yay, like. I've never pandered for a like before. I just pandered for a like. That's awesome. Do it if you want. But no, thanks for joining us today, everybody in chat. And thanks for all of the awesome questions. There's a lot more than I figured we'd get. So we will revisit those. I got them starred. I will check them off. We'll get to them. And hey, we brought this to an hour. So what meant to be 20 minutes, we're here and we're loving it. Thanks for joining us. Tab, where can people find you to learn more before we sign off?
Yeah, I've got a YouTube channel as well. I got a website, kisorganics.com, and the Cannabis Cultivation and Science podcast is also something people can check out. So thank you.
Yeah. Glad to see you. You saw it here first, Anthony. All right, everybody.
All right, buddy.
Have an excellent day. We will catch you guys later.